In Intro to Histology Connective Tissue, you have to understand that there's a bunch of tissues you have to know of. The first of which is the epithelial tissue, which we've covered in a previous video. Then there's muscles, nervous, and finally connective tissue. And as for connective tissue itself, there's a bunch of forms of specialized connective tissue, most of which you already know of. The first is the bone, and then covering the ends of the bone would be the cartilage. Then in the vessels, you can find there's the blood, the lymphatic tissues, and finally there's fat, also known as the adipose. And now that I've covered specialized connective tissue, you have to know what connective tissue is made of. Okay, so there's three components. There's the cells, the protein fibers, and the ground substance. When we talk about the cells, you have to understand that there are two types of cells for connective tissue. There's resident cells and the wandering cells. Resident cells, they don't move around much, so they can be regarded as permanent cells. And then there's wandering cells, which move from tissue to blood when there's a specific stimuli, for instance, an infection. Next up would be the protein fibers. There's the collagen, reticular, and elastic, which we'll cover in the next video. And then there's the ground substance itself, which has, you can imagine it as a gel-like medium. So now that we've covered the general gist of what the connective tissue is made out of, let's actually move on to the cells of the connective tissue. Okay, so we can begin with the fibroblasts. So fibroblasts, there's the active fibroblasts and the fibrocytes. The active fibroblasts here refers to the continuous secretion of protein fibers. And fibrocytes is basically an inactive form of the active fibroblasts. So they don't really secrete anything. So the characteristics of the active fibroblasts includes elongated cells, cytoplasmic projection, ovoid nucleus, which has sparse chromatin and one or two nucleus. And as for the fibrocytes themselves, it's typically smaller than active fibroblasts. It's spindle shape and it has a small nucleus. And then you have the adipose cells or fat cells. So the adipocytes is very easily recognized. It looks like a ring. So it can occur singly or occur in group. It's got this narrow rim of cytoplasm. It has a flattened nucleus and it's got a large empty space in the middle. Okay, next up we have the mast cell. So this mast cell, it secretes histamine, and from the characteristics, you can see it has an ovoid nucleus. It's got these dense staining basophilic granules, and it even has a small centrally placed nucleus. Okay, next up would be the macrophages. So according to the National Institute of Health, these macrophages, it has another name, histiocyte. And so histiocyte is a morphological term referring to tissue-resident macrophages. And all and behold, we're talking about resident cells today. So these macrophages, or histiocytes, they perform phagocytosis. It has a small nucleus, it's rich in chromatin, it's round, it has an irregular cell outline, and it has these brown ingested foreign material. And why does it have brown ingested foreign material? Because it phagocytoses these foreign materials. Okay, and when we talk about wandering cells, you have to know that the monocytes, it differentiates or develops into these macrophages. Next, wandering cells would be the basophil. It's bilobe, and it has these purple cytoplasmic granules. Next up would be the lymphocytes, which secrete antibodies. It's a spherical cell, and it has a dense staining nucleus. These lymphocytes have no nucleoli, and it also has the condensed chromatin. Next up would be neutrophil. So when we talk about neutrophil, it's very easily comparable to the eosinophil, and one of the stark difference in function between these two is that neutrophil defends against bacteria, whereas eosinophil defends against parasites. So based on the appearance of the neutrophil, you can see its multi-lobe nucleus, and it has no stained granules in the cytoplasm. As for the eosinophil, it's bilobe, which means it has two lobes in the nucleus, and then you have the large eosinophilic cytoplasmic granules that you can find in the eosinophils. And finally, you have the plasma cells. So these plasma cells is very special because, judging from the appearance, you can see it has this nucleus that looks like a clock, and we call this clock face nucleus. And the reason why it has this appearance is because there's clumps of condensed chromatin which distributes peripherally, which means it distributes on the sides, and it just so happens to distribute in a circular manner or a radial pattern. And yeah, this nucleus is eccentrically placed, which means it's placed weirdly. And that covers the cells of the connective tissue.